A guy named Andy LaRocque played guitar for us. He entered and assisted us with the records alone. We needed a permanent player for King Diamond, so we couldn't take them away. Additionally, we discovered Bobby Covley, a superb guitarist. He plays from the bottom of his heart. Chuck Schuldiner is credited for creating death metal and revolutionizing the way that people view death in music. Chuck was more than simply a musician. He was a quiet icon who remained loyal to himself in the face of the chaos and commercialization of the metal industry. He had unrivaled guitar technique, philosophical lyrics, and an unwavering soul. Millions of people hold him in high regard as the founder of contemporary death metal, a trailblazer who, with his personal suffering and isolation, established the groundwork for a whole genre. Many people believe that the album Scream Bloody Gore was the catalyst that brought death metal to the attention of the world. Its personal, symbolic, and resolute sound became eternal landmarks in the history of extreme music. A modest person who loved animals, loved his family, and once aspired to be a veterinarian rather than a theater star was hidden behind those fierce tracks. He shunned drink, hated pretense, and once called off a show because the promoter had attempted to include a demonic sign on the poster. Chuck Schuldiner was the epitome of the metal world's lovely paradox, where death was a starting point for in-depth contemplations on identity, loss, and life rather than its conclusion. A musician whose music spoke louder than words ever could, who didn't need to shout for recognition or scandal to be remembered. What, then, transformed a timid Florida youngster become the timeless representation of death metal? And why is Chuck Schuldiner still regarded as an indelible legend more than 20 years after his death? Watch this video to discover out. Childhood. Chuck Schuldiner was born into a Jewish, Spanish, and Austrian family on May 13, 1967, in Long Island, New York. Chuck, who was the youngest of 3 siblings, was raised in a loving but modest family. His family relocated to Florida in 1968, which would go on to become the birthplace of death metal. A sensitive soul was gradually developing there, surrounded by peaceful streets and the normal middle-class life of America. One that the world was still unaware would completely change a whole musical genre. Chuck was an introverted child from a young age. He detested noisy games, was a loner, and didn't fit in at school. To his teachers, young Schuldiner appeared to be an ordinary student, silent, and with mediocre grades. But Chuck was always important to his family. He was oddly fascinated by life, death, and music. Chuck was only 16 when the first pivotal moment occurred. Tragically, his brother Frank lost his life in a motorbike accident. Chuck's inner world was forever altered after that loss, leaving an unseen scar that would never completely heal. Death was no longer an ethereal idea. It started to bother him every day, not in a ghoulish sense, but rather as a deep question that needed to be answered. Why are we here? What is the true meaning of death? Chuck's parents gave him a guitar to help him deal with his grief after Frank passed away. They were unaware that he would be saved by this gift, the only friend who could relate to their youngest child's storm. Chuck didn't attend music school or receive any official instruction. He learned to play almost purely by ear. And it was this unadulterated instinct along with unsaid suffering that started to mold a musical style that was passionate, emotional, philosophical, and very human. Chuck's distaste for education was never concealed. He left high school too soon, disregarding social norms in order to pursue his passion and live authentically. He believed that education should be used to understand, not to fit in, and that music was the best way to learn about suffering, others, and oneself. Although Chuck Schuldiner's early years weren't tragic in the traditional sense, they were distinguished by his early awareness of mortality, loneliness, and silent loss. It was the early years of a person who wasn't quite ready to face the normal world, but also didn't belong to it. A vagrant who discovered that the music he made with his own hands was his only real haven. Early career. Chuck Schuldiner, at 16 years old, formed the Florida band Mantas in 1983 with 2 pals, Rick Ross, guitar, and Cam Lee, drums, vocals. This was more than simply a garage band of teenagers. It was the start of the movement that would eventually define death metal as a whole. Using crude recording equipment in a tiny bedroom, they started writing fast-paced, death-themed songs with a distinct structural approach, steering away of the chaotic inclinations of many extreme bands of the era. Chuck produced a number of self-recorded demos with Mantas, including Death by Metal, 1984, Reign of Terror, and Infernal Death. These cassette recordings swiftly became treasured artifacts in the underground community. Death metal did not yet have a recognized label, But Chuck's music had already transcended thrash, surpassed speed metal, and gone into a depth that no other genre had ever explored. By 1984, Mantis had changed their name to Death, which encapsulated the spirit of the music they were making in a straightforward yet ominous way. Internal conflicts started to surface about the same period. Rick Ross and Cam Lee were the next to depart the band. Chuck decided to continue on his own. Death was no longer a conventional band after that. It became Chuck Schuldner's personal vision, a solo voyage in which each concept, line, and tune came from a single brain. Chuck moved around a lot between 1985 and 1986, working with different musicians to improve Death's roster. After playing with Slaughter for a while in Canada, he relocated to California to join Possessed. But in the end, he went back to Florida to finish his own task. He joined drummer Chris Reifert there, and the two started working on Death's first album. Death published Scream Bloody Gore in 1987, considered to be the foundation of contemporary death metal, their first official full-length album. Chuck wrote and recorded the album under very tight circumstances, and he performed almost all the instruments solo. However, the result was astounding. A new musical period, more radical, heavier, and ready to face issues most people avoided, began with Scream Bloody Gore. Human helplessness, emptiness, decay, death, and flesh. In addition to being acoustically stunning, the record made the whole metal scene pay attention. With no big label support, no gimmicks, and no prominent stage presence, a young man from Florida had produced something more impactful than many heritage bands could have ever imagined. Chuck Schuldiner set out on a journey that he could never reverse, becoming the driving force behind a brand new genre while simultaneously enduring all of its demands, loneliness, and uncertainty. Due to the very decisions that set him apart. Professional achievement. Creating music was never Chuck Schuldner's goal. He understood exactly what he was going for as soon as Scream Bloody Gore, 1987, came out. It was expression, not fame. Pain, anger, and the unsolved questions that had plagued him since his brother's death were all processed via music. Chuck recorded nearly all of the tracks on that first album, which not only rocked the metal scene with its raw, effective structure and heaviness, but it also set the groundwork for a genre that didn't even have a name at the time. Death metal. Chuck didn't stop there, either. Death's second album, Leprosy, 1988, demonstrated that he was more than a one-time sensation. The songwriting became more deliberate, the riffs tighter, and the sound sharper. Additionally, it was the first time Chuck began incorporating social commentary into his songs. He addressed the topic of life support and the right to death in Pull the Plug. He tackled genocide and human indifference in Born Dead. Spiritual healing emerged in the midst of debate in 1990. Chuck ventured to address evangelism for profit, abortion, religious abuse, and delicate subjects. Some members of the fan base, who favored the gore and blood aesthetics that were popular in metal at the time, denounced him. Chuck, however, did not recoil. He said in interviews that Chuck's first significant hit was Human, an album that is considered by both fans and critics to be a turning point in the history of death metal. Death's sound changed significantly with a roster that included virtuosos from Cynic, such as Paul Masvidal on guitar and Sean Reinert on drums. Strange time signatures, advanced technique, and sudden transitions from harsh riffs to abstract harmonies made the music more intricate and cerebral. The lyrics became introspective and philosophic. Death metal was no longer the only genre. It was philosophy expressed through sound. 1993's Individual Thought Patterns explored the psyche in much greater detail. Chuck started to examine individual freedom, intellectual independence, and social control this time around alongside powerful drummer Gene Hoglan and fretless bass virtuoso Steve DiGiorgio. Instead of rebellion, the album served as a manifesto for opposition in mind. In addition to making them headbang, the music caused them to stop and reflect. Chuck released Symbolic in 1995, Death's masterpiece, according to many fans. By this point, the message went beyond the bounds of extreme metal, the technically was perfect, and the lyrics were emotionally impactful. Chuck seemed to be attempting to balance suffering and hope in songs like Empty Words, Crystal Mountain, and Perennial Quest, which sounded like passages from a spiritual journal. In addition to receiving positive reviews from metalheads, Symbolic was featured in mainstream music magazines, which is uncommon for an extreme metal album. Chuck wasn't done, though. The Sound of Perseverance, Death's last album, and his most lucid declaration on life and death, was published in 1998. The music, which alternated between classical and the pained cry of someone struggling to breathe, reached nightmarish heights. Many were taken aback by the instrumental tune voice of the soul's quiet. It stood like a last breath, a silent digression from a guy who realized his time was running out, in an otherwise heartbreaking record. Chuck soon revealed Control Denied, a new project in which he aimed to produce melodic, clean vocal metal while keeping the depth and technicality of his earlier work. Its first and only publication was The Fragile Art of Existence, 1999. Chuck was diagnosed with a severe brain tumor while supporters awaited the follow-up. Chuck, a man who never sought celebrity, had to fight for his life just as the metal community was starting to acknowledge him as a legend. But he never let his music falter till the very end. No hurried releases, no trend chasing, no shortcuts. And that's the very reason Chuck Schuldiner wasn't just successful, but enduring. A legend that is respected by both fans and critics, as well as other musicians. Personal life, given the name of the band Death, one may assume Chuck Schuldiner was a sinister, violent, and even vicious person. However, many who met him in person reported otherwise. Among the most gentle, modest, and caring individuals in the metal community was Chuck. He lived with his mother, Jane Schuldiner, and sister, Beth Ann, in a modest home in Florida for the most of his childhood. Chuck believed that his family was his one and permanent source of support. He rarely discussed himself in the scores of interviews he did give, but he always thanked his mother, not as a rock star, but as her youngest son who had never really left her arms. Jane was the one who looked after him until the end. Chuck never got married, but in his last years, he found peaceful company with a woman named Bethan, who also happened to be his sister's name. Although she wasn't well known or featured in magazines, she was his biggest source of support during his difficult fight with a catastrophic cancer diagnosis. She was one of the 3 individuals that supported him when everything started to go wrong, including his future, his music, and his health, together with his mother and sister. Chuck was unique in the metal community because he abstained from drugs, alcohol, and crazy partying. He was more of an animal lover than a human. In addition to saving, feeding, and caring for many stray cats, he once contemplated quitting music to pursue a career in veterinary medicine. In numerous interviews, he said that if it weren't for music, he would have started an animal shelter, a sanctuary for little, frail lives, just like the one he so desperately wanted after his brother passed away. Chuck didn't like attention or loudness. He steered away from scandals, never put on a front, and avoided the media. To his pals, he was always trustworthy, happy, and occasionally quirky. He was incredibly courteous to his fans, responding to handwritten messages, speaking with them after performances, and never being superior to anyone. His lyrics, which emphasized respect for life, resistance to hypocrisy, and defense of individual freedom, represented his outlook on life. He wasn't a gloomy person. Instead, because he had a profound appreciation for life, he wrote about death. He never gave in to pain, but he also didn't deny it. Chuck was so special because of that contradiction, gentleness inside anger, quiet amid yelling. Chuck Schuldiner made the decision to live a very simple life, devoid of any luxury, mansion, nice cars, or pool. Within the 4 quiet walls of his tiny Florida home studio, he wrote music that revolutionized a whole genre. And when the attention went away, his life went on, quietly, fully, and without anyone having to testify. Illness and last days Chuck Schuldiner started having excruciating headaches in late 1999 while he was getting ready to record Control Denied's second album. At first, he wrote them off as stress or overwork, but following examinations, he was given a heartbreaking diagnosis. There is minimal to no prospect of recovery from pontine glioma, an aggressive and incredibly uncommon type of brain cancer. With so much unfinished business at age 32, Chuck was forced to face a foe that music could not fight. He had his first operation on December 13, 1999. He passed away precisely 2 years to the day. Despite the tumor's temporary removal by the physicians, his lengthy and painful recuperation forced him to put all musical endeavors on hold. Soon, Chuck's family was in financial trouble because of the exorbitant expense of his treatment. They had to borrow money, sell possessions, and ask for assistance since they lacked health insurance. However, the international metal community showed unheard of empathy in this difficult time. In Chuck's honor, hundreds of musicians, bands, and fans planned benefit performances and contribution drives. There were Chuck charity performances all over the world. Everyone, including Ozzy Osbourne, Cannibal Corpse, Napalm Death, and Testament, provided financial, emotional, and spiritual support to the guy they referred to as a living legend who was fighting for his life. Chuck persevered through exhausting rounds of chemotherapy. He kept writing music, playing guitar when he could, and holding out hope that he might come back. He was thankful and hopeful in his letters to followers. Not a hint of bitterness, not a word of self-pity. He once claimed that the tumor had returned at the end of 2001, this time with greater vigor. Chuck suffered from chronic pain, had trouble eating, and was often admitted to the hospital. But his mother, sister, and girlfriend never left his side, not even for a second, during this entire ordeal. Chuck declined to pass away in a medical facility. He desired to return home, to the area where he had been raised, composed music, experienced intense love, and lived his life. Chuck Schuldiner passed away at his Florida home on December 13, 2001, precisely 2 years after his initial surgery. In the company of his loved ones, he died without any pomp, spectacle, or stage lights. However, word of his passing sent up a worldwide outpouring of grief and remembrance. The same fact was echoed by millions of messages, memorials, and thousands of publications across the US, Europe, and South America. A unique soul that would never be able to be replaced had left the planet. Chuck Schuldiner didn't go into despair or die yelling. He passed away peacefully, bravely, and with great humanity, just as he had lived. Influence and legacy. Chuck Schuldiner left no enormous riches, a monument named after him, or a significant media push to honor his legacy. However, he left behind something far more permanent, an artistic, spiritual, and human legacy that endures in the hearts of millions of listeners of extreme music worldwide. When discussing legacy, we have to start with Death, the band he not only started but also fully personified. Death didn't merely exist during its 14-year existence, from 1987 to 2001. It changed continuously. Death blazed a trail that broke all rules, from unpolished, early recordings to intricately technical pieces brimming with philosophical nuance. Instead of making a template, Chuck Schuldiner destroyed all of them. Because of this, no two Death albums have the same sound. Every stage signaled a fresh development, a turning point that many bands have since attempted to imitate but haven't nearly surpassed. Chuck's impact is still felt today by progressive bands like Opeth and Between the Buried and Me, black metal and avant-garde bands like Enslaved, Eason, and Devin Townsend, as well as technical death metal giants like Obscura, Nile, Gojira, and Beyond Creation. Not only did he tackle music, but he also questioned life, society, and the purpose of life in general. Technically speaking, Chuck Schuldiner invented several ideas for contemporary metal guitar. Use of intricate key modulations, layered riffs, and unusual chords. He broke away from conventional verse-chorus structures, positioned solos as emotional rather than ego-driven moments, and combined classical melody with thrash pace to create songs that tell stories. However, his life and creations may have left a greater legacy than his technical prowess. Chuck demonstrated that is capable of creating extreme music without having an excessive mindset. You can maintain your inner peace even in a noisy world. You have a greater passion for life than anyone else, even if you write about death. Chuck Schuldiner continues to be an unwavering symbol to his supporters. Each year, tribute pages are made, festivals are held in his honor, and a t-shirt featuring the words, "Let the Metal Flow," "Crystal Mountain Solo," or "The Sound of Endurance" is posted online. His spirit is kept alive by each tiny flame. Chuck is regarded as one of the most important musicians in metal history by major publications such as Metal Hammer, Loudwire, Revolver, and Guitar World. Additionally, performers outside of the metal genre paid tribute to him in 2021 on the 20th anniversary of his passing, realizing that Chuck wasn't merely a member of a certain musical genre. In art itself, he belonged to a deeper truth. Chuck Schuldiner was not one to follow the herd. He never made concessions to the market, and as a result, his music endures forever, never becoming old, unreplaceable, or forgotten. Being a legend was never Chuck Schuldiner's goal. He was just a music lover who remained faithful to his genuine feelings, constantly making an effort to live a moral life, regardless of how crazy the world got. He lacked attention-grabbing quotes, a captivating voice, and a movie star look. Chuck, however, created a whole new chapter in metal history with just a guitar and a genuine heart, not just through skill, but also with spirit and mind. He transformed music into an introspective experience where people may contemplate death rather than fear it, where extreme metal learned to listen instead of just screaming, where anger was transformed into a force for creation rather than destruction. Although he lived a brief life, just 34 years, Each year, record and lyric reflected the worth of a guy who never gave up, never compromised, and was never forgotten. In addition to being the founder of death metal, Chuck Schuldiner was a unique artist who was brave, honest, and kind enough to forge ahead without a plan. Perhaps Chuck's immortality came from his ability to meet death with music, faith, and silence rather than death itself. Chuck established that you don't need to shout to be heard or rebel to be remembered in a world where everything is noisy and readily replaced. All you have to do is be completely sincere in your creations and in your life. How do you feel about the steadfast and motivational path of Chuck Schuldiner? Which of his songs had the most emotional impact on you? To continue discovering the tales of immortal legends, leave your opinions in the comments section below and remember to hit like and subscribe. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the upcoming video.